On December 11, 1978, a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest told his mother he had a job interview and would be home soon. He worked part-time at a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois, and a contractor who frequented the store had offered him a higher-paying construction job. He said he just needed to step out for a few minutes to discuss the details and collect his final paycheck from his current shift. He left the pharmacy a little after 9 in the evening. He never came home. His mother, Elizabeth Piest, waited outside the pharmacy in her car for over an hour before going inside to ask if anyone had seen him. What she learned set in motion one of the most extensive missing persons investigations in Illinois history, and what that investigation eventually uncovered would become one of the most disturbing crime scenes ever processed by American law enforcement. 33 young men and boys murdered over a period of 6 years. 29 of them buried in the crawl space and yard of a modest ranch house in unincorporated Norwood Park Township, just outside Chicago. The man responsible for those deaths was a heavy-set, balding building contractor named John Wayne Gacy. He was a respected figure in his community. He had shaken hands with the First Lady. He had been named Man of the Year by a local Jaycees chapter. He organized and performed at charity events, at hospitals, and at children's parties in a costume he had designed and sewn himself, appearing as a character he called Pogo the Clown. To understand how a man could build this specific and elaborate public identity while committing crimes of this scale and horror in the private space of his own home, we have to go back to the beginning of John Wayne Gacy's life, to a childhood defined by a difficult relationship with his father, to a pattern of criminal behavior that began years before his first murder and that the justice system repeatedly failed to fully address, and to the specific, terrible mechanics of how 33 young men came to be buried beneath a house in a quiet Chicago suburb. John Wayne Gacy Jr. was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, the second of 3 children and the only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson. His father was a machinist, a World War I veteran, and by every account that has survived him, an extremely difficult and often abusive man. He drank heavily. He was verbally cruel to his wife and children in ways that left permanent marks on young John's sense of himself, frequently calling him weak, calling him a sissy, expressing open disappointment in a son he felt did not measure up to whatever standard of masculinity he held. Gacy suffered from a heart condition as a child that limited his participation in the kind of physical activities his father valued, a circumstance that deepened the rift between them. And he was also, according to biographical accounts compiled after his arrest, sexually abused by a family friend during his childhood, an experience he did not disclose to his parents at the time and that would remain a largely unaddressed trauma throughout the rest of his life. Despite this difficult home environment, Gacy presented, by adolescence and into early adulthood, as an ambitious and socially capable young man. He struggled academically and never completed high school, eventually earning a business diploma through a vocational program in Las Vegas after a brief period living there in his late teens. He returned to Chicago and began building a career in sales and management, eventually taking a position with the Nunn Bush Shoe Company, where his natural charisma and work ethic led to rapid advancement. He was transferred to Springfield, Illinois, where he became deeply involved in the Jaycees, a community service organization for young professionals, throwing himself into volunteer work and social events with an intensity that colleagues found impressive and that would remain a consistent pattern throughout his life, an almost compulsive need to be seen as generous, active, and beloved within whatever community he inhabited. In 1964, he married Marlon Myers, whose family owned several Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises in Waterloo, Iowa. Gacy relocated to Iowa to manage these restaurants for his father-in-law, and by outward appearances, his life had taken the shape of conventional American success: a wife, eventually 2 children, a stable career, an active role in the local Jaycees chapter, where he was elected to leadership positions and organized community events with the same relentless energy he had shown in Springfield. But beneath this public success, a pattern of predatory behavior toward teenage boys and young men had already begun. In 1968, Gacy was indicted in Waterloo, Iowa, for sodomizing a teenage boy, the son of a fellow Jaycees member, whom he had lured to his home with the promise of showing him pornographic films before sexually assaulting him. He was convicted of sodomy in December 1968 and sentenced to 10 years in the Iowa State Penitentiary. While Gacy was incarcerated, his wife divorced him, and he lost custody of their 2 children. He would later describe this period of his life to investigators and psychologists with a striking absence of remorse regarding the assault itself, framing his prison time primarily as an inconvenience and an injustice, rather than a consequence of harm he had caused another human being. Notably, he was a model prisoner, working diligently within the facility, and was granted parole after serving less than 2 years of his 10-year sentence, a decision that in retrospect represents one of the earliest and most consequential failures of the criminal justice system to adequately assess the danger Gacy represented. He returned to Chicago in 1970 following his parole and moved in with his mother, who had by then divorced his father. He soon began building a new life in the northwest Chicago suburb of Norwood Park Township, eventually purchasing a modest ranch-style home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in 1971, the property that would become the site of almost all of his subsequent murders. Only months after his release from prison, and while still technically on parole for the Iowa sodomy conviction, Gacy was arrested again, this time for allegedly attempting to force a teenage boy into sexual acts at gunpoint. The boy who made this accusation ultimately failed to appear in court to testify, and the charges were dropped, a pattern that would recur throughout Gacy's life. Victims and witnesses who, for reasons ranging from fear to shame to simple lack of institutional support, did not follow through on complaints, allowing Gacy to continue operating without any sustained legal consequence despite a documented history of predatory behavior toward adolescent boys. He established a successful contracting business called PDM Contractors, specializing in remodeling work, and built a reputation in the local business community as a hardworking, reliable, and generous employer, frequently hiring teenage boys and young men for his construction crews, a hiring practice that would later be understood as providing him with direct access to many of his eventual victims. Gacy remarried in 1972 to a woman named Carol Hoff and continued his intensive involvement in local civic life, joining the Norwood Park Jaycees, where he again rose quickly through leadership positions, organizing elaborate community events, and eventually developing the clown persona that would become the most infamous and grotesquely ironic detail of his public life. He created 2 distinct clown characters, Pogo and Patches, designing and sewing the costumes himself, and performed at children's hospitals, charity fundraisers, and neighborhood parades throughout the 1970s, building a local reputation as a warm and generous entertainer even as, during this same period, he was murdering young men and burying their bodies in the crawl space beneath his home. The first confirmed murder attributed to Gacy occurred in January 1972, when he killed a young man named Timothy Jack McCoy, whom he had picked up at a Chicago bus station. Gacy would later claim, in various accounts given over the years, that this first killing occurred during a moment of panic after waking to find McCoy standing over his bed with a knife, though the veracity and consistency of this account, like much of what Gacy told investigators over the following decades, remains difficult to fully verify given his documented tendency towards self-serving. fabrication. Following this first killing, Gacy's pattern of predatory behavior escalated steadily throughout the 1970s. He developed a consistent method of luring victims, most of them teenage boys and young men, some of them employees of his contracting business, others picked up at bus stations, on the street, or through connections in Chicago's gay bar scene. Though many of his victims were not themselves gay, and Gacy's targeting of specific individuals appears to have been driven more by opportunity and vulnerability than by any consistent type. He would often invite young men back to his house under various pretexts, offering alcohol or marijuana. And at some point during the encounter, he would perform what he called a rope trick, a manipulation in which he convinced his victim to allow themselves to be handcuffed, framing it as a magic trick or a game, at which point Gacy would reveal his true intentions, sexually assaulting and then murdering his victim, most often through strangulation, sometimes using a rope tourniquet method that left distinctive markings later identified by forensic examiners. After each murder, Gacy would bury the body in the crawl space beneath his house, a shallow, cramped space that he had specifically prepared over the years for this purpose, using lime in an attempt to accelerate decomposition and control odor. As the crawl space gradually filled with bodies over the following years, he began burying additional victims in trenches he dug in other parts of his property. And, as the available space beneath and around his house was exhausted toward the end of his killing period, he began disposing of at least 4 of his final victims by driving to the Des Plaines River and throwing their bodies into the water. Throughout this period, spanning from 1972 to 1978, Gacy maintained an extraordinarily active and, by most external measures, successful public life. His contracting business grew. He continued his prominent role in local Jaycees activities, being named Chicago's Outstanding Vice President in 1975, and later serving as a precinct captain for the Norwood Park Township Democratic Party, a position that in 1978 earned him a photograph taken with First Lady Rosalind Carter at a public event, an image that would become one of the most widely circulated and unsettling artifacts of the entire case once his crimes became known. His neighbors and business associates described him almost uniformly in terms that echo the accounts given about other serial killers who successfully concealed extensive criminal activity behind a veneer of civic engagement. Friendly, if somewhat overbearing and prone to exaggerating his own accomplishments. A hard worker, a generous host who threw large parties at his home, and someone who occasionally exhibited a volatile temper, particularly when he had been drinking, that some acquaintances found unsettling even without any awareness of what it might indicate. There were warning signs that in retrospect represented missed opportunities for intervention. Complaints from parents and young men who had been assaulted or propositioned by Gacy periodically reached local police throughout the mid-1970s. But these complaints, much like the earlier gun-related charge that had been dropped after his release from Iowa, frequently did not result in sustained investigation or prosecution, hampered by the same combination of victim reluctance, institutional skepticism regarding allegations involving young men and sexuality, and Gacy's own considerable skill at presenting himself as a respectable and trustworthy community figure whenever questioned by authorities. The investigation that would finally end Gacy's killing spree began in earnest following the December 1978 disappearance of Robert Piest. Detective investigators from the Des Plaines Police Department, led by Lieutenant Joseph Kozenchuk, quickly identified Gacy as a person of interest after learning that he was the contractor who had approached Piest about a construction job at the pharmacy that evening, and that Gacy had a prior criminal record involving sexual assault of a minor. Kozenchuk obtained a search warrant for Gacy's home on December 13, 1978. And though the initial search did not reveal a body, investigators noted a strong, unusual odor throughout the house, and discovered several pieces of physical evidence, including a ring that would later be traced to a previous missing person, and receipts that established connections between Gacy and other young men who had disappeared under similar circumstances over the preceding years. Recognizing the pattern emerging from these initial findings, police placed Gacy under close, round-the-clock surveillance while continuing to build their case, a period during which Gacy, apparently aware that he was being watched, grew increasingly erratic, at one point inviting the surveillance officers into his home for drinks and conversation, seemingly unable or unwilling to fully accept the severity of the situation closing in around him. On December 21, 1978, 9 days after Piest's disappearance, Gacy confessed to a friend that he had killed approximately 30 people over the preceding years, though he would later attempt to walk back elements of this confession during subsequent formal interviews with police. On December 22, investigators returned to the Summerdale Avenue house with an updated search warrant, and this time, upon excavating the crawl space beneath the house, they discovered human remains. Over the following weeks, in one of the most extensive and disturbing crime scene excavations in American criminal history, investigators and forensic teams painstakingly recovered the remains of 26 victims from beneath and around the house, work conducted in freezing Chicago winter conditions that added significant physical difficulty to an already harrowing task. 3 additional bodies were later recovered from other burial locations Gacy identified during his interrogation, and 4 more victims, whose bodies had been disposed of in the Des Plaines River due to the exhaustion of burial space on his property, were eventually recovered from the water, bringing the total confirmed death toll to 33 young men and boys, ranging in age from 9 to 21, making Gacy, at the time of his arrest, the most prolific serial killer in American history, by confirmed victim count. The identification of the remains presented enormous forensic challenges given the state of decomposition and the limited technology available in 1978 for identifying skeletal remains. Several of the victims would not be formally identified for years, and remarkably, as recently as the 2010s and 2020s, advances in forensic genetic genealogy, the same category of technology that would eventually identify the Golden State Killer decades later, have allowed investigators to finally identify several of Gacy's previously unnamed victims, providing long-delayed answers to families who had waited decades to learn what had happened to sons and brothers who vanished during the 1970s. Gacy's trial began in February 1980, and his defense team pursued an insanity defense, arguing that he suffered from a severe personality disorder that had rendered him unable to appreciate the criminality of his actions at the time of the murders. The prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney William Kunkel, presented an extensive case built on the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene, testimony from surviving assault victims who had escaped earlier encounters with Gacy, and expert psychiatric testimony arguing that Gacy's methodical concealment of his crimes over a 6-year period, including his careful use of lime and his systematic burial methods, demonstrated a clear and consistent understanding that what he was doing was both criminal and requiring active concealment. On March 13, 1980, after a trial that had captivated national media attention, the jury rejected the insanity defense and convicted Gacy on 33 counts of murder, along with related charges of deviant sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child. He was sentenced to death for 12 of the murders that had occurred after Illinois reinstated capital punishment in 1977, and to natural life imprisonment for the remaining 21 murders that had occurred prior to that date. Gacy spent the following 14 years on death row at the Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, during which time he became, like several other notorious serial killers of his era, an object of significant public and academic fascination. He gave numerous interviews to journalists, psychologists, and true crime researchers, consistently maintaining a posture of victimhood regarding his own case, alternately claiming innocence, minimizing his culpability, or attempting to shift blame onto his victims by characterizing them as male prostitutes or willing participants in dangerous behavior. Mischaracterizations that were directly contradicted by the substantial evidence establishing that many of his victims were vulnerable teenagers with no connection to sex work, who had simply crossed paths with Gacy through his business, through chance encounters, or through his deliberate predation on young men frequenting bus stations and other transit hubs. During his years on death row, Gacy also took up oil painting, producing a body of work that included self-portraits in his Pogo the Clown costume, alongside various other subjects. Paintings that would later become disturbingly sought-after collector's items in the aftermath of his execution, generating a market and cultural fascination with murderabilia that remains ethically contentious to this day. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered that reportedly included both protesters opposed to capital punishment and members of the public who had traveled to the site to celebrate the execution, some setting off fireworks as news of his death was announced, a stark illustration of the polarized public reaction that Gacy's crimes had generated across the 14 years since his conviction. In the years following his execution, the Cook County Sheriff's Office undertook renewed efforts to identify Gacy's remaining unidentified victims, a project that has continued into recent years using advances in DNA analysis and genetic genealogy that did not exist at the time of the original investigation. As of the most recent identifications, several victims who spent decades known only by case numbers have finally been given back their names, allowing their families, many of whom had spent over 40 years wondering what had happened to a son or brother who simply vanished, to finally receive confirmation and, in some cases, to finally hold a proper burial. What the Gacy case leaves behind, beyond the specific and enormous scale of his crimes, is a set of deeply uncomfortable questions about the systemic failures that allowed him to continue killing for as long as he did. The repeated pattern of complaints against him throughout the 1970s, from parents, from young men who had survived assaults, from associates who had grown suspicious of his behavior, represents a cumulative record of warning signs that individually might have seemed insufficient to justify sustained action, but that collectively paint a picture of a system that consistently failed to connect the dots regarding a man who was, by any reasonable assessment, an obvious and escalating danger to the young men in his community. This failure was compounded by broader social attitudes of the era regarding sexuality, particularly the stigma and skepticism that often met allegations involving male victims of sexual assault by other men, a bias that likely contributed to the reluctance of some victims to come forward and to the reduced credibility afforded to those who did, allowing Gacy to continue operating in plain sight for years after the first formal complaints against him had been filed. The victims of John Wayne Gacy included Timothy Jack McCoy, his first known victim, killed in January 1972. John Butkovich, who had worked for Gacy's construction company and whose disappearance in 1975 prompted his friends to repeatedly press police for investigation. Suspicions that were not adequately pursued at the time: Darrell Sampson, Randall Reffitt, Samuel Stapleton, Michael Bonin, William Carroll, James Hackinson, Rick Johnston, William Bundy, Francis Wayne Alexander, Gregory Godzik, John Syke, John Prestige, Matthew Bowman, Robert Gilroy, John Mowry, Russell Nelson, Robert Winch, Tommy Bowling, David Talsma, William Kindred, Timothy O'Rourke, Frank Landingen, James Mazzara, Robert Piest, whose disappearance finally brought the killing to an end, and a number of victims whose names remained unknown for decades, identified only in recent years through advances in forensic technology. alongside those whose identities remain unconfirmed to this day. 33 young men and boys, most of them between the ages of 14 and 21, taken by a man who spent his evenings sewing clown costumes and organizing charity events for sick children, and who returned home to a house where he had spent 6 years quietly burying the evidence of what he had actually become. The pattern, as it always is, does not belong to the man in the clown costume, to the photographs with dignitaries, to the awards and the community recognition that Gacy pursued with such relentless and, in retrospect, chilling determination. It belongs to the parents who filed complaints that were not taken seriously enough, to the friends of John Butkovich who knew something was wrong and could not get anyone to listen, to Elizabeth Piest, who waited in a car outside a pharmacy for a son who would never come home, and whose refusal to simply accept his disappearance without answers is the reason this entire case was ever uncovered at all. To every family who spent decades not knowing, and who in some cases only in the last several years finally received a name where for so long there had only been silence. They are the reason this story is told. They always were.